So it seems that it's Advent gifts for the Aeldari today. Let's talk about some fast-moving grav tanks and a surprisingly effective and dangerous alliance from the Drukhari and Harlequins. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Aeldari Detachments with another double bill of new rules for Warhammer 40k, courtesy of Games Workshop. This Grotmas Advent calendar is now into day 13, at least one new detachment every single day, all fully playable in competitive tournaments and everything like that, with points cost for enhancements written on them. The rules come into the app in January. Yesterday we had Chaos Space Marines with a melee rush list for the creations of Bile, and for this one we've got Aeldari with swift moving grav tanks and Drukhari with Harlequins, with really quite an interesting and dangerous assault formation, the two sides trying to outcompete each other in a spectacle of bloodletting. Tomorrow it's going to be the Orcs, which I think should be a fun one. There's plenty of different army archetypes that they could go into for those. I feel like something Bad Moon flavoured would be kind of fun though. Jumping straight into the detachments though, and first up we have the Armoured Warhost. This one's the Craftworld Aeldari one, and as was rumoured previously, it does indeed represent the speed and firepower of an Aeldari grav tank force, basically sort of Ironstorm Spearhead or Necron Starshatter arsenal, but for Aeldari grav tanks, sleek hover tanks annihilating enemies with exotic weaponry, and supporting a mechanised assault of Guardians and Aspect Warriors. As themes go for the Eldar, it did seem like a pretty reasonable one to have in their lineup, not one that they have in their upcoming codex. That one sounds like it's got a jet bike focused Wind Rider host and a Wraith host, but the grav tanks are still a pretty major theme in the army that wouldn't really be covered by either of those. I guess the primary focus for this detachment would be the Falcon grav tank, Wave Serpent, Night Spinner and Fire Prism, and I guess it supports other things like War Walkers and Vipers and Void Weavers. That doesn't really do anything for all the Wraith units given that they have the monster keyword. I feel like plenty of these units are usable enough already, so definitely on paper could be interesting if they did make this one strong. And Mekdar with a whole bunch of Wave Serpents has definitely been powerful in the past. For the core rule of this detachment, they've got Skilled Crews. You gain the assault keyword on Aeldari vehicles, so advance and shoot, and also fly vehicles on top of that gets to reroll advances. As a core rule for the detachment, I don't think it's awful, but at the same time I don't think it's really that great. The extra speed definitely doesn't hurt, and you could have grav tanks zooming around a pretty ridiculous distance with that. Most of them move 14 inches, so could well be moving 18 inches and still shooting reliably. And it could mean that they could potentially jump from cover to cover and just position absolutely optimally, maybe with line of sight to one target, but in a position that the opponent might struggle to shoot them back. I feel like though with the fast speed that they already have, you might be getting into diminishing returns here. I mean, they can already move 14 inches, and that's significantly better than quite a lot of armoured formations out there. At least as things stand, you're taking a massive trade out here with losing the Battle Host rerolls. Rerolling one hit roll and one wound reroll is a massive impact to damage, particularly for the Falcon grav tank, but also for things like War Walkers. I guess Fire Prisms already have some built in, so maybe it impacts them a touch less than otherwise, but I feel like just gaining yet more speed on an already fast army is probably going to be a negative trade-off in the short term versus masses of damage. I guess this might be one to take in context with the upcoming codex though. I really wouldn't be too surprised if Battle Host doesn't give a reroll to hit and wounds when it's remade in the War Host, just because that seems kind of hard to balance against other detachments unless you gave them some obscenely strong stuff. In the meantime though, I do feel like the core rule is a downgrade. Then for Stratagems, we've got a 5+ feel no pain against mortal wounds, not unhelpful, and particularly against certain devastating wound combos, though I'd say for the most part mortal wounds aren't the single biggest thing that toughness 10 3+ save vehicles have to fear. Standard anti-tank weapons are generally going to be the thing that they need to be wary of. There's one called Swift Deployment, which is one command point. This one allows you to advance and drop a unit out of a transport. This one works well with a detachment rule I suppose, so you could advance, shoot and still have a unit get out of a Wave Serpent or Falcon. Maybe fairly reliably adding an extra 3 inch to the threat range of say Fire Dragons in Melter range perhaps. It does maybe feel just a touch on the niche side, but I guess it does mean that you can use mechanised units and not sacrifice the fairly extraordinary speed of the detachment when you need to. Then there's Vectored Engines, which allows you to fall back and shoot with a fly vehicle, so not things like War Walkers. That's definitely a nice handy one to have access to in a sort of armoured theme list, perhaps particularly one that's going to be playing aggressively and going for big lines of sight. Though bear in mind that the current Battle Host does have a directly better stratagem allowing you to fall back, shoot and charge, so at least compared with current Battle Host, again that's a bit of a downgrade. This one also seems to be temporarily broken rules as written due to it only affecting the movement phase and not the shooting phase, though I feel like intent of that is pretty clear that it's able to fall back and shoot. I certainly wouldn't go deny Aeldari players the ability to do that in actual games. For one command point there's Cloud Strike. This one's a deep strike drop at 6 inches for a flying vehicle which potentially can be a transport and then get its contents out. Falcon Grav tanks already have Deep Strike, but this gives you Deep Strike to any of the other units, so you could use it on something like a Wave Serpent or Fire Prism. I guess potentially you could use it to get some pretty aggressive lines of sight, maybe hitting an enemy with some really big firepower that otherwise would have been hidden, maybe even using some sort of linked fire combo from a Fire Prism, I suppose. You could also use it to deliver some shooting, say some Fire Dragons out of a Falcon Grav tank, though you could still do that at 9 inches anyway. Maybe it could be an option to secure them a better drop and attack site, or potentially even just use something cheap like a Viper to drop down to do a secondary objective if this will make the difference. Definitely seems like an interesting one, though would have been far more powerful if it had been a 3-inch Deep Strike before they all went away. That could have meant that you could have put Fire Dragons instantly within Melter range, which would have been kind of big. You'd only be getting the Fire Pike in Melter range here though. Still seems potentially interesting. I guess in this list you might well have Falcons in reserve with Fire Dragons in them or similar. You could maybe just plan to Deep Strike them normally, and then this one could be an option if they need it. Next up, for one command point, there's Soul Sight, which is a damage dealer one. You commit to this before you've attacked, and you reroll a hit, wound, and damage result for your vehicle. I guess the initial reaction to this is that it's not really so different from what you get in Battle Host completely for free on every vehicle all the time. The only upgrade on that is that you get the damage result reroll, which might or might not be relevant. I think it's not awful on a big shooter unit with a whole bunch of anti-tank shots. Again, Fire Prisms already get their rerolls, so probably overkill there. Maybe something like a War Walker or two, or again a Falcon Grav tank. Though I feel like committing before you've rolled any dice is a little bit of an irritating one, as you could just completely waste the stratagem if you get lucky and make your hits and wounds this time. I still think it's not terrible, definitely does increase damage output overall, and again might just feel a bit better if Battle Host does go away in terms of the massive damage boost it gives you. Finally, for one command point, we've got Anti-Grav Repulsion, minus 2 inches to charge a flying vehicle. That one does feel like quite a nice support one and could throw a spanner in the enemy's plans. Probably going to be most impactful if you're say charging from like 7 inches away and you make it go up to a big 9 or similar things like that. It could be pretty good at denying deep strike charges too. Overall, I must admit I'm not particularly overwhelmed either by the special rule or by the stratagems. Vectored Engines is definitely useful, though you can get it in Battle Host. Cloud Strike seems okay, but still far easier to screen out places compared with a 3-inch Deep Strike would have been. Soul Sight is kind of similar to Battle Host damage output, and the rest are usable but maybe just feel a little bit on the niche side. Finally though, we get onto the enhancements. First up, we've got Guiding Presence for 25 points. This one has to be on a Psyche unit, and you grant +1 to hits for a vehicle model within 9 inches at the start of the shooting phase. That one's certainly not too bad for a nice bit of extra damage that you could put on a different vehicle as it made sense to. I guess Night Spinners aren't going to have much effect from that, given that they have the indirect penalty, but could maybe be okay on a Fire Prism or Falcon. You could use it on units that arrive from reserve as well potentially, given that it happens in the shooting phase. I feel like it's a small but helpful boost, though it doesn't really have any one thing that seems to be super great with it. Fire Prisms with their rerolls already have a good chance of converting their hit rolls. Falcons seem like they could be a little bit borderline in terms of the damage to warrant it, as to War Walkers, and Artillery can't really make use of it. Next up, we've got the Harmonization Matrix, which is 30 points. This one gives you a 3+ chance to generate a command point if a bearer is on an objective marker that you control in the command phase, and this one also works if you're in a transport as well. This one seems fine for the 30 points if you're not taking an Autarch. If you are though, then it's completely redundant, as he just gets you an automatic 1 command point per turn, so it's just basically directly better, and this will never come up. Next up, we've got the Spirit Stone of Raelith. This one's 20 points, and it basically makes the bearer into a sort of Aeldari Tech Marine. It gives them Lone Operative when they're within 3 inches of vehicles, and can heal them D3 wounds in the command phase. This one doesn't seem terrible, though maybe would have been a bit more impactful if it could affect things like the Wraith units. I feel like a fair few of the Grav Tank profiles are ones that just might have a good risk of just being shot down in one turn if they're exposed, rather than leaving ones damaged on half health. Definitely doesn't seem terrible to have a character with Lone Operative protection following your vehicles around though. Maybe it could be nice on a Farseer Skyrunner perhaps, or even maybe an on-foot Autarch where you could get the command point generation for nice and cheap versus the Wayleaper, and also have Lone Operative protection and this extra healing ability. Finally, for 15 points, we've got a redeploy one called Guileful Strategist. This one allows you to redeploy 3 units, and you can put them into strategic reserve if you need. As ever with this detachment, it's locked to Aeldari vehicle units. These ones are generally okay. You get to see your opponent's deployment zone, but you don't know whether they're going first or not. Particularly combined with the big movement characteristics you can get in this one, you could easily do things like refuse a flank. and perhaps try and redeploy everything over to one side and just annihilate one side of the battlefield before moving round to another. It definitely feels like this one does have potential, and you could use it to put things off the board and maybe threaten to deep strike with that Cloud Strike one. This one does seem fairly nice. If you've got a character without an enhancement, 15 points seems pretty reasonable for that ability. Overall for this one, I feel like this detachment definitely has its flaws, though just taking on its face value without trying to weigh it up against Battle Host or anything, it does seem to provide at least fairly good general support for Aeldari tanks and skimmers. Advance and shoot all the time takes their movement from very good to kind of insanely quick. You will be able to push on the enemy and get lots of nasty lines of sight, or potentially play keep away and hide behind terrain and make sure you get the first strike. Fall back and shoot is nice, the -2 to charge is nice, the reroll damage one is nice enough, though compares badly to Battle Host getting it for free. I'd say the enhancements seem like they're handy enough that you could have them on supporting characters, perhaps that Spirit Stone one with the Lone Operative and the healing, and the redeployment one being my favourites. The other two are both usable depending on what other things that you might have in the army though. I feel like at the moment at least though, it just compares kind of horribly to Battle Host. Losing a single hit and wound reroll on all those scary lance shots is quite a big deal, particularly for the Falcon Grav tank, which otherwise seems like one of the focal units for this detachment. I guess it's maybe a little bit less impactful on the fire prisms though, as they already get some, so perhaps they could be the mainstay here. Even beyond that though, for Aeldari vehicles, I feel like Battle Host has a lot of advantages for them. Fire and Fade is great on fire prisms in particular, potentially nosing one out and dealing loads of damage, and then hiding it again. Lightning Fast Reactions is a more general purpose durability one, and Feigned Retreat is basically the fall back and shoot one but better. It feels like the only big advantage that this detachment really has on that is the extra movement, which definitely is fun, but given that they're quite quick already, I genuinely just feel like the Battle Host rerolls add so much more. Overall, for that reason at the moment, the detachment maybe just feels a little bit on the confused side, just seems kind of directly weaker than the index even for Grav tank armies. But perhaps this is one that really just needs to be taken in context of the Aeldari Codex and weighed up against any new unit profiles and detachment rules when we get that, as it could be that things change quite a lot for this, both between unit profiles and also what it's competing against. I still think it could be kind of fun to push you into playing a very different version of Aeldari, but in terms of outright strength it just looks a bit lacking to me at the moment. Let me know what you think though. How powerful do you reckon that this one is in game? Moving on though, that certainly isn't all the Space Elf goodness that's coming out in Warhammer 40k today. For the Drukhari, we've got a rather intriguing formation called the Reaper's Wager, and the lore of this one is that it's basically an alliance of Drukhari and Harlequins who are going out and deciding to slaughter people. Apparently the Reaper's Wager is a Harlequin performance of a whole load of macabre bloodshed. It sounds like this isn't the sort of recital that the vast majority of the other races of the galaxy would really want to get in the way of. The idea behind this one is kind of interesting in that it's sort of supposed to be Drukhari and Harlequins trying to outdo each other, though on the face of it does look like you could actually make a really quite effective Drukhari force of this with absolutely zero Harlequins, or maybe just one allied unit or something. And with one of the enhancements that could still be a pretty effective fighting force. The Stratagems are really quite powerful and good. For the Drukhari we've already got two detachments for them. They've got the Real Space Raiders and the Sky Splinter Assault, and they were sort of doing kind of mid-table-ish in terms of win rates prior to the update, though for some reason in the December one, they seem to get hit by quite a lot of unneeded nerfs. I guess when the Drukhari Codex arrives, there'd be some more dedicated detachments for Kabbalite Warriors, Witch Cults, and Homunculus Collins, so maybe it makes sense that the extra one is a bit more of a different oddball style one. In any case, the core rule for this detachment is called Callous Competition. First up, it allows you to take up to half your force as Harlequins, an upgrade on the 25% or so that you get from the Harlequins and Travelling players. You can include all the Harlequin units, though they can't be the Warlord. The core rule is a damage dealer style one, where basically you track whether or not the Harlequin half of the army or the Drukhari half of the army is losing the Reaper's Wager, and when they are, they get 2 reroll or hit rolls of 1 and wound rolls of 1 whenever they make an attack, whether it's shooting or fighting. When the game starts, the Harlequins are the ones that start out as losing the wager, so it's the Harlequins that get the rerolls to hit and wound of 1 at the start of the battle. When a Harlequin unit kills an enemy unit, the buff will flip to the Drukhari, so they'll be losing the wager. And then again, if they manage to destroy an enemy unit, it'll flip back to the Harlequins. For the core rule, it basically amounts to a damage boost to the side of the army that didn't slay the last enemy unit. It's kind of an interesting and quite quirky detachment rule, a bit different to a bunch of the other ones that we've seen. I think it's impactful enough to be really quite worth considering. That is a good damage boost there, and it's really nice on anything that didn't already have hit or wound rerolls built in. That maybe does feel like it's a little bit hard to control. If units haven't quite died at the right time, you might well not have the buff on the units that you most want it on. though you can get a bit of control of it with a Drukhari enhancement, which basically gives you the opportunity to expend a pain token in the command phase to flip it back to the Drukhari getting the rerolls, which could be pretty impactful if you are playing the force with majority Drukhari units and just a few Harlequins perhaps. Moving on to the stratagems for this one, and I feel like these ones are really kind of stand out good pretty much throughout. They're best suited to supporting Harlequin and Drukhari melee units, so things like troops, witches, incubi, maybe grotesques would all profit quite a bit. First up, there's just a nice straight damage boost of 1 command point for either lethal hits or sustained hits when you're shooting or fighting. That's nice easy extra damage on the unit that needs it most. It'll be more impactful if you can use it on bigger and scarier units, and you could potentially combine it with pain tokens as well to really double down on just one unit dealing far more damage than you might expect. Definitely feels handy to have, particularly with that being so flexible. Next up, for 1 command point, there's Fateful Roll. This one gives you a 4+ chance to fight on death, and you get a +1 to the roll if that side of the army happens to be losing the wager at that time, which I feel like might be a little bit less easy to orchestrate, but makes it better like half the time I suppose. Again, I think that's really quite handy for fragile melee units such as Drukhari and Harlequins, even just in its base form. It'd be really handy if, say, a troop is getting wiped out or a unit of incubi. The enemy won't just be able to countercharge them and roll them up without taking any hits in return. Next up, there's Murderer's Circus, which is -1 to hit in the fight phase. Definitely handy enough to have and would come up. You could use it on durable stuff like Talos as well. Would have been better if it had the option to be against shooting as well. But still, this could definitely be worth it if it's going to give you a better chance of surviving with enough models to strike back hard. I guess you might have to weigh it up versus fights on death quite a lot of the time. For 2 command points, we've got the Dance Macabre. This one's a reactive move of d6 inches for Drukhari or Harlequin infantry, triggered when the enemy moves within 9 inches of you, and it's boosted up to a normal move of 6 inches if that relevant side of the army happens to be losing the wager. I feel like pretty much most of the time 2 command points for a random d6 inch move just isn't going to be viable. You could just roll a 1 for that and then your unit doesn't really get any significant movement whatsoever. But I think in the right circumstances 2 CP for a 6 inch reactive move could be game changing enough that it saves a unit via stopping an enemy charge or being able to back away from an oncoming melee. It does feel situational as you both need to have the command points handy and also for it to be worth it versus other stuff. And I think the 2 command points makes it feel a lot more niche versus if it was a 1 CP one. Finally though, we're back to some fairly standout good ones. For 1 command point, there's Shorten the Odds, Advance and Charge, which can be for any unit. Again, that one's going to be pretty standout great for melee units trying to be able to make a long charge. It's not quite got the crazy potential of the very, very long charge out of Sky Splinter, but isn't really all that far behind out of units jumping out of transports, and you could use it for things that aren't in transports too. Things like Grotesques or Talos wandering across the board, or fast movers like Helions. Finally, for 1 command point, there's Scintillating Tempo, and this one's another really big one in preventing Overwatch. You declare it before you've made a normal move, so you can't wait for your opponent to declare Overwatch against them. Or you could declare it when they're set up on the battlefield or when they declare a charge. Basically, until the end of the turn, the opponent is unable to overwatch that squad, so you could declare it in the movement phase, and then that also safeguards them against charging as well. And this one seems a pretty excellent one for fragile toughness 3 damage dealers trying to make melee. Pretty great for supporting things like troops, incubi, or witches throwing themselves into combat, but it's just pretty good for a whole bunch of things trying to take mid-board objectives as well. Say for example, you could be having a bunch of Cabalite warriors or Raks just march up to the mid-board and steal an objective right in front of some Infernus Marines or Rupert Marines or something, and they wouldn't be able to burn you off the objective. Overall, that's a really strong cluster of stratagems, and particularly stand out for a whole bunch of units that want to close the gap and make some melee happen. Finally, there's still some great stuff in the enhancements as well. Arc Raider gives you a 9-inch scout move for a character and a unit starting in a dedicated transport. That seems kind of godly as a staging opportunity there. Means that you could have a big scary squad in a raider camped in a mid-board ruin right from turn 1, maybe making use of some infiltrating mandrakes to make sure that they're not pinned back. Particularly with an advance and charge, that easily means that you could be having first turn charges, or just give an annoying presence on an objective that the opponent might have to deal with really quite early, and won't get the opportunity to take any pot shots at that raider beforehand if you can take cover with it. Certainly seems like it could be worthwhile on Venoms or the Starweavers too. Next up, for 15 points, there's Webway Walker, which is Deep Strike for the Bearer's unit. If the Bearer's unit is currently losing the wager, it also gets 2 reroll charge rolls on a turn in which they Deep Strike. So I guess that means a 9-inch with a reroll gives you around about a 50-50 shot of getting into melee straight out of reserves. That one definitely feels interesting to me. Deep strikes on things that shouldn't usually be able to get it is really quite cool. I'm not 100% sure what would be the best target for it though. I guess ideally you might want it on a fragile shooting unit that wants to get dead close and can take a leader, but they don't really feel like units that fit that bill so well. Otherwise, for melee stuff, I guess maybe you could think about deep striking and gambling on the charge with some Harlequins and a troop master maybe, or using rapid ingress to put them down in terrain and then being able to do a long charge after that. Or I guess you could use it on a solo character to give them deep strike for a fairly cheap squad. Maybe something like the Lone Operative Death Jester or Cheap Witch Succubus. Feels like there probably would be interesting uses of it. That doesn't seem like the single most obvious one to me. Next up, for 25 points, there's the Reaper's Cowl, and this one gives a Harlequin Models unit Stealth and Infiltrators. The Stealth thing is nice enough, though I feel like it's not usually going to make the difference between a Harlequin unit actually being hard to kill or not. They're still going to be really quite fragile for the points when they're exposed to enemy shooting, though I suppose it doesn't hurt. Again, though, it does feel like you could just have a really disruptive unit in the midfield with the access to really long charges or being able to deny Overwatch. And given that Harlequin units start with the rerolls as well, you'd also be rerolling all hits and wound rolls on the turn that you charged in, most likely. Feels like if you did go big on a troop though, then it could be a bit all or nothing. If the opponent was able to get lines of sight on them and take out a number of them, then it could just be an expensive way to get a lot of models killed. It certainly needs to make sure that they're set up nice and safe. Finally, and potentially the most important enhancement for the whole detachment is Conductor of Torment. This one's for a Drukhari model only, and in the command phase you get to do one of two things. First up, if the Drukhari units are currently losing the wager, you can gain one pain token and flip it back to Harlequins so they get the rerolls. Or alternatively, if the Drukhari units are currently winning the wager, then instead you can choose to expend a pain token, and then it's the Drukhari units that get all those hit and wound rerolls of 1. This one seems like really quite nice manipulation of the mechanic, and my instinct is that you'd probably be going heavier on the Drukhari units versus the Harlequin units in this one, so it could be quite good just to be able to flip it back to Drukhari units each turn that you needed to. It would take a small toll on the pain tokens, but to be honest it doesn't really seem like the biggest price to pay. You'd sacrifice some big rerolls on one unit, but instead you gain essentially army-wide rerolls for the Drukhari for reroll ones to hit and wounds, up until the point until you actually wiped out a unit and it flips back to the Harlequins once more. It does just seem on paper that if you could manage to keep this guy safe, say in your deployment zone, maybe something like a Homunculus with a bunch of racks perhaps, you could just basically use this as an excuse to run the detachment with nothing but Drukhari, and just see the detachment rule as basically getting reroll ones to hit and wound for your entire army all the time, up until the point where you actually destroy an enemy unit each turn and then they turn off. Just seems like you could be getting really quite a bunch of scary shooting and lance fire and things out of that, and you could still put in, say, a token Harlequin unit or two. Perhaps melee ones that could embrace the hit and wound rerolls, when inevitably you do kill something and the damage buff flips to the Harlequins once again. Overall though, at first impressions this one does seem really quite fun. A very different detachment rule to a bunch of the slightly copy-paste ones that we've had in the past. It does look like there's probably enough strength here for it to be genuinely impactful and play around the actual core mechanic. Besides the rerolls, which I think are nice enough, the stratagems just provide absolutely excellent support for melee units. Advance and charge denies Overwatch, -1 to hit in combat, fights on death, and then a nice easy damage buff that's both range and melee. All of those seem handy. And the reactive move even might come up in a pinch, even if I think 2 command points is a bit pricey. Then you've got the helpful enhancement that allows you a bit more control of the core rerolls. I think I would want that somewhere in the army, and then the scouting and the infiltrate enhancement could both give you some really interesting first turn charge options, or the power to do some rather horrendous move blocks, though maybe you might still be best off using things like Beastmasters for that. I guess for downsides it might not appeal to Drukhari players that don't have or want any Harlequins, though having said that, as mentioned, I do feel like you could actually pretty viably run this without any Harlequins whatsoever. It certainly seems easily strong enough for casual games that way, though I suspect that you'd want at least some for more competitive optimised lists. Otherwise it definitely has some trade-offs with Sky Splinter and Real Space Raiders. Sky Splinter has the big damage output out of transports and long charges and things like that. Real Space Raiders does have some pretty nice stratagems too. And I guess in 2025 we might have pretty big rewrites of both the Aeldari and the Drukhari codexes at some point, which could easily change things a fair bit. Overall though, seems really fun to me. Hopefully it might be at least somewhat of a consolation prize for Drukhari players after their balanced data slate treatment, which did seem rather harsh. In any case though, as always, let me know what you make of the new detachments. Look forward to hearing your thoughts on them down in the comments below as always. If you'd like to see videos on the rest of them, I'll have them all collected in my Grotmas detachment playlist down in the video description. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. And finally, if you'd like to help support the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page. That's linked down in the video description below, and it's the main thing that allows me to treat this as a full-time job, making new videos each day. If you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, any support is massively appreciated. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early from time to time, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.